Saint Paul the Apostle. The guy who went from persecuting Christians to being the ultimate Christian evangelist. Talk about a complete 180. You know, we all have those days when we change our minds, but Paul? He went from being the chief villain of Christianity to its most powerful apostle, but not without a fair share of controversy along the way. Paul's story is one of redemption, sure, but also one of intense conflict, church drama, and the occasional disagreement with even the other apostles. Saint Paul, originally named Saul, was a Pharisee who initially persecuted Christians, believing they were a threat to Judaism. But after a dramatic encounter with Christ on the road to Damascus, he converted and became one of Christianity's most vocal and influential advocates. Paul traveled extensively, preaching to both Jews and Gentiles, and wrote many letters, epistles, that form a significant portion of the New Testament. While Paul's conversion and missionary work were revolutionary, his teachings often sparked heated debates. His belief in the equality of Gentiles, non-Jews, and Jews within the Christian community was controversial at the time. His assertion that Gentiles didn't need to follow all of the Jewish laws to be Christian led to a major schism within the early church, leading to the infamous Council of Jerusalem where Paul's views were ultimately accepted. His letters, full of sharp theology and passionate appeals, often set the tone for the direction of Christian doctrine but also raised eyebrows with some of his harsh criticisms of other apostles and his stance on issues like women's roles in the church. Paul's teachings on women, in particular, have been both revered and criticized for their apparent contradictions. While he championed women in some roles, in other places, he suggested they should remain silent in the churches, which continues to spark debate in modern times. In addition to theological disagreements, Paul's boldness in spreading the Christian message, often at great personal risk, led to him being imprisoned and eventually martyred. While he is undoubtedly one of the most influential figures in Christian history, his theological ideas and outspoken nature often made him a controversial figure, even among early Christians. Saint Louis IX. Saint Louis IX, the king who ruled like a saint but led crusades like a conqueror. Louis IX was a man of deep faith and lofty ideals, but let's not forget, he was also leading crusades and making decisions that would forever impact the course of history. A pious king? Absolutely. But one who was embroiled in a series of controversial crusades and questionable political moves? Oh, you bet. So was he a saint, or just another monarch with a complicated legacy? Louis IX was king of France from 1226 until his death in 1270, and was later canonized as a saint due to his deep religious devotion and attempts to live out his Christian faith. He was known for his charitable acts, his strong sense of justice, and his devotion to the Christian faith, as well as his personal piety. Louis lived modestly, even though he was king, and made reforms to ensure that his kingdom adhered to Christian principles. However, Saint Louis IX is also controversial for his involvement in the Crusades, specifically the 7th and 8th Crusades, which ultimately failed. His involvement in these crusades led to military disasters and the loss of a significant amount of French resources. While Louis was deeply religious, some modern critics argue that his crusading efforts were more about territorial gain and political power than purely spiritual motives. He even led an expedition against the Muslims in North Africa, which ended in failure and humiliation, and his actions were seen as part of the ongoing Christian-Muslim conflicts of the time. Additionally, Louis IX's treatment of Jews has come under intense scrutiny. He was responsible for expelling Jews from France, ordering the burning of Jewish books, and enforcing harsh anti-Semitic laws. While his religious zeal and dedication to his faith earned him sainthood, his actions toward minority communities have sparked considerable controversy. How can someone who was so deeply devout also engage in actions that caused harm and suffering to vulnerable groups? Saint Teresa of Avila. Now here's a saint who definitely knew how to stir things up. Mystic, visionary, reformer, and basically the ultimate girl boss of the 16th century. She didn't just sit around praying in silence. No, Teresa decided to break some serious boundaries, and not everyone was on board with it. In fact, her mystical visions and spiritual experiences made the church sit up, look concerned, and occasionally whisper, "Is this woman for real?" Saint Teresa of Avila was a Spanish nun, mystic, and theologian born in 1515, and she's known for her deep spiritual experiences, including vivid visions and mystical encounters with God. In a time when women weren't exactly in the driver's seat of the Church, Teresa wasn't just going to sit quietly in a convent. She founded the Discalced Carmelites, a more rigorous and strict branch of the Carmelite order. She pushed for reform, calling for stricter discipline, prayer, and asceticism in the order. But Teresa's mystical experiences and the intensity of her visions didn't exactly make her popular with everyone. The Church was constantly questioning whether her visions were truly divine or just a product of an overactive imagination. She claimed to have experienced spiritual ecstasies that led her into deep rapture, sometimes with physical reactions that seemed out of the ordinary, like levitation or intense fainting spells. Yeah, imagine that going down in the church, the clergy trying to figure out whether this was holiness or simply some strange side effects from too much fasting. Despite the controversy, Teresa was a groundbreaking figure in Catholic mysticism and spiritual reform. But you can see why some people thought she was a little much. Still, she was eventually declared a Doctor of the Church, a title reserved for the most influential theologians and mystics. But it was definitely a journey to get there. Saint Ignatius of Loyola. Saint Ignatius of Loyola, the man who literally founded the Jesuits, or, as I like to call it, the original spiritual SWAT team of the Catholic Church. This guy didn't just get by with a few good prayers and peaceful retreats. No, he went full military strategy, and somehow managed to mix spiritual warfare with the holy mission. If you think you're hardcore about your faith, wait until you hear about Ignatius and his whole let's conquer the world with spiritual discipline thing. Ignatius of Loyola, born in 1491, was a Spanish soldier who was injured in battle and underwent a spiritual awakening that led him to renounce his military career and dedicate himself to the Church. He founded the Society of Jesus, also known as the Jesuits, in 1540, a religious order that focused on education, missionary work, and spiritual discipline. Ignatius didn't just preach about faith, he structured it with military precision. The Jesuits became known for their rigorous training and strict vows, and they spread rapidly across the world, taking on both religious and political influence. But Ignatius wasn't without controversy. The Jesuits were accused of being too political, too involved in the affairs of the state, and some even thought they were a bit too close to the papacy, as their loyalty was often tied to the Pope's authority. They were also seen as a threat to the established social order, given their strong presence in education, governance, and even diplomacy. Ignatius and his order were criticized for being highly organized and mission-driven, which made some question whether they were more about power than piety. On top of that, Ignatius' spiritual exercises, which emphasize self-discipline and rigorous introspection, have also been controversial. Some believed the exercises were too intense and borderline psychologically manipulative, creating a mindset where complete submission to God's will was the only path to holiness. Saint Francis Xavier, the man who took global evangelism to an extreme level. Forget local parishes. This guy went on a world tour of conversions, spreading Christianity across Asia like it was a Netflix series. And while his dedication was admirable, let's just say his methods didn't win him everyone's approval, especially in the places he was trying to convert. Saint Francis Xavier was a co-founder of the Society of Jesus, Jesuits, and one of the most influential missionaries of the 16th century. Born in Spain, he embarked on missions to places like India, Japan, and even parts of Southeast Asia, and is credited with converting thousands to Christianity. Xavier's relentless drive to spread Christianity across the globe was legendary, but his methods sometimes raised eyebrows. While his evangelism was undoubtedly effective, the means by which he went about it were sometimes controversial. Xavier was known for pushing a conversion agenda in areas where local beliefs and religions were deeply ingrained. In some instances, he encouraged missionaries to adapt local customs to make Christianity more accessible, but in others, he pushed for complete conversion, often questioning or undermining the value of indigenous spiritual practices. His missionary zeal sometimes turned into cultural imposition, and in places like Japan and India, some people criticized the way his presence disrupted local religious systems. Even within the church, there was debate about his extreme zeal. Some praised him for spreading the Christian faith so effectively, while others thought he was too rigid in his methods, at times disregarding the complexity of local cultures and religions. His legacy as a missionary is a double-edged sword. While he did incredible work in spreading Christianity, his legacy also carries the weight of colonial imposition. Saint Thomas Aquinas. Saint Thomas Aquinas, the doctor of the Church and the guy who basically tried to prove everything logically, including God. This guy's theological game was so strong, they had to make a special category for him. You know how some people are good at math? Well, Aquinas was good at making philosophy work with reason. But hold on, this doesn't mean Aquinas wasn't a walking controversy. Thomas Aquinas was a Dominican friar and theologian born in 1225, and he became one of the most influential thinkers in Christian history. He is best known for trying to reconcile faith with reason in his monumental work, Summa Theologica. Aquinas took Aristotle's philosophy, the Greek philosopher who thought everything could be logically explained, and blended it with Christian doctrine, which, for many at the time, was both revolutionary and controversial. Aquinas argued that faith and reason could coexist, a concept that was a tough pill to swallow for those who thought faith should stand alone, free from logical explanations. But Aquinas didn't stop there. He also made some bold statements about things like the role of women, the nature of sin, and the justification of slavery. Yes, you read that right. His defense of slavery, particularly, has drawn harsh criticism in modern times. It's not exactly the kind of saintly thought most would embrace today. On top of all that, Aquinas spent years trying to prove the existence of God through pure reason, because why not just throw down a solid theological argument for the most controversial topic ever? So, let me get this straight. Thomas Aquinas. Let's figure out if God exists using logic. But imagine trying to solve that puzzle. Okay, I know I have faith, but let me use my calculator and Aristotle's philosophy to find proof. Just casual Wednesday stuff, right? Meanwhile, here's Aquinas, sitting in a study somewhere, like I've got this, just need a few thousand pages and a solid reason to convince everyone. Saint Joan of Arc. Saint Joan of Arc, the teenage warrior who literally saved France, but ended up being burned at the stake for it. Talk about going out with a bang, and I don't mean the battle cry. Joan is hands down one of the most iconic and controversial saints of all time. She didn't just break social norms, she obliterated them, all while hearing voices, and not the good kind. Joan of Arc was a 17-year-old peasant girl in 15th century France who claimed to have received visions from saints instructing her to support Charles VII and help France win the 100 Years' War. She convinced the French king, led an army, and achieved some remarkable military victories, even though she was a woman in a time when women were basically only expected to be seen, not heard, let alone commanding armies. However, Joan's rise to power didn't sit well with everyone. Her claims of divine visions and her leadership in battle were viewed as highly suspicious, leading some to accuse her of heresy. She was eventually captured, tried for witchcraft, heresy, and dressing like a man, big no-no at the time, and was burned at the stake at just 19 years old. Fast forward a few decades, and surprise, surprise, Joan was exonerated and canonized as a saint by the Catholic Church. But before that, she was a martyr whose bold defiance of social norms and the Church's authority made her a lightning rod for controversy. Was she a saintly hero? Or was she just an unstoppable teen who was just really, really good at her job and made everyone uncomfortable in the process? Both? Yes. Okay, picture this. You're a 17-year-old girl in the 1400s, and you've got visions from saints telling you to lead an army. Your response? Heck yeah, let's take down the English and save France. Oh, and also let's wear men's clothes while doing it, because, fashion, am I right? Joan was basically the first medieval warrior with a YOLO mindset, except instead of I'll just stay home, it was I'm going to burn things down, become a saint, and leave a lasting legacy.